Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're going to be talking about the use of solitary confinement here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Joining me as my guest tonight are, to my left, Rabbi Charles Feinberg, who is the Executive Director of Interfaith Action for Human Rights. And to my right is Delegate Patrick Hope, who represents the 47th House District.
Right.
Thank both of you for being here.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank
you
Good
for
to be here.
inviting us.
Yes, good
So the big news, Delegate Hope, I have heard recently on good authority that you are now the chair of the House Committee for Militia, Police, and Public Safety.
That's correct.
So this kind of is a game changer for our discussion here tonight about changing the use or the protocol or abolishing solitary confinement here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
Let's just start out by talking a little bit, and I will punt this over to Rabbi Feinberg, because you have a lot of statistics and you've been working on this, your organization has for a long time, on tracking down the extent to which solitary confinement is used, and also trying to track down the effects on the people who have been in solitary confinement, some of them for many years.
So last year, under Delegate Hope's leadership, a bill was passed. The first reporting bill was passed in the Commonwealth, which asked the Department, the Virginia Department of Corrections, to produce statistics of how solitary is being used. So we know that it's a system that has around 30,000 people in it at any one time in the state system. And we know that they reported that about a little over 7,000 people were entered solitary. Another 7,000 people exited. We don't know how many people were in solitary more than once from this, but it's a significant number of people. And we know that about 30% of those who've been in solitary were in more than a month. And we have anecdotal evidence that there are not many people are in there for months and years in solitary in the state system. The other thing to note is that in addition to the state prison system, there are regional jails by counties or groups of counties. And that's a whole nother area that we do not have statistics for. But we do have plenty of anecdotal evidence that solitary is used a lot in the county and regional jails, and that there's significant abuses of it in these jails.
So IHR, Interfaith Action for Human Rights, is part of a coalition of actually 16 different organizations.
Yes.
You know, and so there is a legislative agenda, SALT, Social Action Linking Together. John Horsch, who is he's a mutual friend of all of ours, who has actually focused a lot of attention on this issue of the use of solitary confinement. So it's not just your group, it's many groups.
Right. And I would just like to, if I can get away from the statistics for a moment, I would say this is also an issue that strikes people of faith very strongly. Our group represents people of faith from Maryland, the district, and Virginia. Mr. Horsch's group also represents people of faith. And we believe that many cardinal principles of our faith that many faiths hold in common are at stake here with the use of solitary confinement. And it's like the solitary becomes the linchpin of how these prisons are run, and I think what's wrong in that it's only looked upon punitively, and there's not enough resources are devoted to helping people make different decisions for themselves. You know, to change is not easy. I've been wanting to go on a diet for years, right? It's not easy to change. And people need support and help to change. And we shouldn't judge people only by the worst decision they may have made in their lives. Often many people regret it. Many people don't want to return to prison, but we don't give them enough help, both educational and vocational, as well as medical. And so medical issues are a big issue in the prison system, as they are in our whole society.
That is true.
As well. So as a man of faith, I believe that people, my faith teaches me that people have the ability to change, that they need support to do that. And I feel that the prison should not only be about punishment. I understand there always would be punishment when people are convicted of a crime. But it would seem to me that we should help them, give them support. And too often people are brutalized in prison. And they come out of prison angrier and more cynical and more bitter than when they came in. And that is not a good recipe, and that's why many people return to a life of crime. They don't have the tools to reintegrate into the community, the vocational and social and psychological tools to do that as well. So it is a huge issue, I think, for our society, and I hope it will be addressed with legislation that will be submitted. Delegate Hope is going to be submitting soon to the legislature.
So, Delegate Hope, were you surprised when this item was brought to you for legislation that they weren't already assessing, tracking, or trying to accumulate data? I mean, was that a surprise to you at all?
No, it really wasn't a surprise. I knew that we knew very little about who's in solitary confinement. And you've visited one prison, and I think it's a completely different atmosphere from one prison to the next. And I think that this exercise of walking through the data, who's in solitary for how long, is I think eye-opening to everyone, because data will drive the issue in how we're going to treat people in solitary confinement. And so I think having the information is our first step. The next step is to ban the practice outright, with some exceptions in extreme circumstances. And the legislation that Rabbi Feinberg talked about, that is going to be what I'm going to bring this year. But this is an issue that I've been tracking for a number of years. It started probably about 7 or 8 years ago when I took a trip down to southwest part of the state, Red Onion Correctional Facility. That's Virginia's Supermax prison. And I walked down the different cell blocks where they have people in solitary confinement. And I talked to one gentleman who had been in solitary for 12 years. Imagine the space, really the size of a parking space, almost the size of the carpet that we have here in the studio. The size of a king-size bed is what we're talking about, 23 hours a day, 7 days a week. And imagine being in that environment, and suddenly your time comes up and you're released right into the community. So many different organizations, world organizations, have labeled solitary confinement to be cruel and inhumane, and I believe it amounts to torture. And ever since I took that first trip to Red Onion, I pledged to do something about it as a legislator. And credit goes where credit's due, is that from that very first trip, the governor was Governor McDonnell at the time and his administration. They really turned a lot of things around in trying to pull people out of solitary and putting them into the general prison population. They've done a very good job and they should be recognized for that. But there's still, to your point, Rabbi, there's still 7,000 people, some of them repeat offenders, that are locked up in solitary. And we need to have a protocol, a system to make sure that, and give them the support they need to get out of that, because it amounts to torture, and we should do better. Yeah,
I would say that the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture defined an act of torture as isolating anyone for more than 15 consecutive days. So that's one of the standards, is for what we call solitary confinement, and then to be isolated for 22 to 23 hours a day. And then even when they're out for an hour, they don't have any contact with anyone else as well.
Yeah.
And so to try to assess what the data is, how many people, how long, but under what circumstances it's used, correct? For instance, if there's not a set protocol, then it can be ambiguous and arbitrary.
That's right, and abused. And we hear stories, anecdotal stories. Prisoners write me because of my personal interest in this. I think a lot of legislators get letters, but because I've been in the media for wanting to solve this problem, a number of prisoners write me and tell me what they're going through. And so whether it's true or not, I don't know. You can't believe everything that someone writes you, but it certainly is different than what the story that the department is painting for us. And Rabbi has a number of contacts as well with inmates as well,
yes.
too. And it's consistent across the board. So there's either something going on here or this is the biggest conspiracy.
Yeah, among
on.
people who are not as a group.
That's right.
So let's talk a little bit about semantics.
Yeah.
So solitary confinement. We don't have solitary confinement. We have restricted housing.
That's right. That's
So
right.
solitary confinement by any other name is still separating people out and isolating them from any other human contact
Yeah.
for long periods of time.
That's right. That's right.
So how are you addressing the we don't have solitary confinement?
You know, I don't care what you call it. I mean, back in the day, they called it in the hole. Then it was solitary. Then it became segregation. And now it's restrictive housing. Whatever you want to do, this sort of cat and mouse show, whatever you want to call it, we need to get rid of it. And having some extreme circumstances, there are some people that might need to be locked up that are very dangerous, and so you want to have an exception if they're going to cause imminent threat to other inmates or correctional officers. We can't afford to have riots and lockdown situations.
But not for months and years.
There are other people that for their own protection, it might be someone in a certain population that could be threatened. People that are notorious, like Lee Boyd Malvo is probably one of the more famous people that's at Red Onion. I didn't get a chance to meet with him, but he's also in solitary. He's there for his own protection. So there are certain people that you have to do that for their own protection. And for those people, we need to make sure that we have the resources to give them the mental health treatment that they need. And there's nothing to say that you have to be locked up 23 hours, 7 days a week. Why not 18? Why not 15? I mean, there's things that we can do to stimulate them to avoid what people have called, United Nations has called the amounts to torture. And so we need to think very strategic, we're very thoughtful about this. We can be one of the first states to think in this way, but we wouldn't be the first state to ban solitary outright, and we should do that.
Yeah, and that's true. There are other states have taken, there's been strong leadership to drastically reduce the amount of solitary, even to end it. One of the leading states have shown leadership on the state of Colorado under the direction of former Director of Corrections Rick Ramish. And so there was prompted by an incident. Someone was released directly to the community from solitary, and he came and rang the doorbell of the Director of Corrections. He opened the door and he shot him dead. And someone said, maybe it's not a good idea to release people directly to the community from solitary, which happens in the state of Virginia. I believe the report said about 165 people are released directly to the community here from solitary confinement. So interestingly enough, I was on a webinar this winter with correction officials from the state of Colorado. And they had a wonderful introduction. They said when Mr. Ramish came in and said he was going to put an end or drastically reduce the amount of solitary, we thought he was crazy. And we thought it was only going to increase tension in the prisons and increase violence. And then he paused, and then he said, we were wrong. In fact, the reverse happened. There was less tension. Mm-hmm. There has been less tension and less violence. Now, they did up the amount of services that they provided to people who were acting out. And they weren't isolating them so severely. They may have for fewer hours at a time and for shorter durations. Mr. Ramish, I met Mr. Ramish recently at a seminar that the Urban Institute in Washington put on, and he was telling me the story that when he first came in, he started touring these prisons. And he came into a medical facility where people were locked up for medical and for psychological issues. And there was a man smearing his feces on the wall, and he was doing it all the time. And so he said, how often does he do it? He says he does it every day, all the time, whenever, all the time, every day. And he says, well, does he do it when he's taken out of his cell? Oh no, he never does it when he's taken out. And so Mr. Ramish said, take him out of the cell.
Yeah.
Don't lock them up. Don't isolate them for 23 hours a day.
Because he's trying to tell you something.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's very interesting because a lot of states that have done this and taken some steps towards reducing the number of people in solitary confinement have actually saved a tremendous amount of money, because it's very expensive to operate these units, because each individual, when you want to move an inmate, it takes 2, sometimes 3 correctional officers to do that. And so if you're closing down some of these solitary units, you're saving a tremendous amount of money that can be plowed back into the programming.
Yes.
So it's mental health treatment, it's other type of programming that does something that our jails and our prisons are supposed to do anyway, rehabilitation. Because most of these people that are in solitary or in the prison population are going to be released one day into society.
Right.
And rehabilitation has always been, at least in the rhetoric, part of that. And so we need to make sure that we do that, because we do have a low recidivism rate, and it's a very positive one and should be commended. But we could do even better. There's plenty of different opportunities by taking these steps, plowing those resources back into different programming and mental health treatment. That's very important, especially for this population.
Oh, I definitely agree. And that's one of the things that I want to circle back around to. We're coming up on a break, and so I do want to talk about mental health issues, who ends up in jails and prisons who shouldn't be there, the kinds of treatment and support that they should have while they're incarcerated, and also what is being done for them once they are released. We have not necessarily been very consistent about reentry programs out of jails and prisons here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So how do we expect people to step out the doors, especially who've been isolated? You know, human beings are social creatures. In fact, all living beings are in flocks or herds or communities. And so when you isolate somebody like that and then say, well, we're now releasing you back into society, how do we expect for people to have the skills or to be in the right mental frame of mind? So I want to talk a little bit about the Diversion First program that we have here in Fairfax County, and how programs like that are trying to steer people away from the criminal justice system. And also the Deeds Commission, which has really worked very hard to try to get better mental health supports now that we've dismantled the mental institutions in Virginia that were not considered to be necessarily helpful for people who needed mental health treatment. So when we get back from our break, we'll be talking with Delegate Patrick Hope, who represents the 47th House District, and Rabbi Charles Feinberg, who is the Executive Director of Interfaith Action for Human Rights. So join us after the break.
Get it.
Get it.
Get it.
Give your town a reason to celebrate, because every Goodwill item you bring home brings job training and more to your community. Goodwill, bring good home.
When I was your age, I was just like you, fascinated by stars. But now I get to search for life in the universe. And who knows, maybe life is looking for us too.
So we're like aliens to them?
Yeah. Does anyone want to be a scientist now?
I do.
Awesome. We need more girls in STEM.
Maybe we can find aliens.
Mom, I got it. What are you doing in there?
I got stuck.
Are you a dog?
I wouldn't do that. Have you seen the pliers? Where'd you find those?
It's not your birthday.
Sorry. Bye, Grandpa. Bye, Grandpa.
Take care of yourself.
What are you doing? What are you looking for?
we're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and today we're talking about the elimination of solitary confinement, except in the most extreme cases. And two gentlemen here with me to really talk about why we should all care about this issue is Rabbi Charles Feinberg, who is the Executive Director of IAHR, which is Interfaith Action for Human Rights, and Delegate Patrick Hope, who is the new chair of the House Committee on Militia, Police, and Public Safety. When we went to our break, we were talking a little bit about mental health. I mentioned the Deeds Commission, not realizing actually that you're on the Deeds Commission. But there is a huge intersection between mental health, the amount of people incarcerated, and I think you, Rabbi Feinberg, actually said it's gone up tremendously, even for people working inside the prisons, from what, 11%?
We were told this summer at a meeting with department officials and with the Secretary Moran, that the head of behavioral health said to us that 10 or 15 years ago, I'm not exactly sure what she said, the right number of years, but something in that area, the 11% of those incarcerated in state prisons had some kind of mental health issue. And now she says it's about 33%.
That's fully a third.
Yeah, it's tripled the amount it was, 10, 15 years ago. So and that's another huge burden on the system. Mm-hmm. But of course, we often think about criminal justice and prison issues in isolation, separate from the rest of society. But I think, especially in mental health, we have to connect it with services that are provided outside prison. If there were better services outside and people had more access, maybe fewer people would be landing inside as well. And then people sometimes resent what is offered to people on the inside of prisons if they don't feel it's offered to them on the outside. Right. And so we need to think about this in a holistic way and a societal way, and not just in a particular, narrow focus. It's really important we think about it so that when people leave prison, they do have access to mental health services as well as when they're inside.
Yeah, and Catherine, you mentioned that I'm the incoming chair of Militia, Police, and Public Safety. That's not really the story. The story is that Democrats now have a majority going in January to the General Assembly. And it's historic because for the first time in forever, it's a progressive majority in which we have the House and the Senate and the governor's mansion. And these conversations that we're talking here, isolation and solitary confinement, is just a narrow topic. But the broader issue, how do you get to prison in the first place? I mean, the 33% or so that are in prison that have serious mental illness, they were probably seriously mentally ill before they arrived. And putting someone in solitary certainly exacerbates that. And so looking at all of these issues holistically and trying to divert and avoid people to get in prison in the first place, that's really what the Deeds Commission is all about. The tragedy with Senator Deeds and his son Gus really highlighted where our gaps in our community system really lie. Virginia Tech also singled that as well. And we need to start putting more funding into community-based services. We've started to do that, we've made some progress, but we have to do a lot better. Most states, on average, put about 75% of their funding for mental health in the community and 25% in institutional type setting. We're right now around 50-50. And so before the tragedy with Senator Deeds and his son Gus, it was the inverse. It was about 75% in institution care and 25% in the community. So we've started to turn that around and trying to bring it back. And so now we're about level. We have to put more resources into the community, because if we can do that, then we can avoid people from being instituted in the first place or committing crimes, and making sure that they have the services that they need to be successful.
And I think this is true too in the juvenile justice system, right?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, understanding that young people at one point were put in facilities that were meant for adults.
Yeah.
Then we created facilities that were meant for juveniles, but that was still not necessarily community-based programs that gave them supports that kept them in their community with their families.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you look at the topic of decriminalization of marijuana, mandatory minimums, the school to prison pipeline. These are all issues that we're going to now take a very evidence-based look at to find out whether our system is set up in a way that is helping that problem, keeping us safer, or it's exacerbating it.
And we have the whole public health problem of addiction, widespread addiction, and often people resort to criminal activity in order to support their addiction. And we too often look upon that only in a criminal justice way and not understanding the broader public health, and not understanding addiction is an illness. Not everyone who takes some of these drugs gets addicted in the same way as someone else. Some people can get off the drugs very easily. Other people hardly ever can get off it. So we have to understand the complexity of the problem and not only judge them for the crimes that they did, I'm not saying we shouldn't, but at the same time to provide services to them so that to help them deal with their addiction.
You know, that brings to mind Ginger Mumpower and her son Spencer. In Beth Macy's book Dope Sick, she actually talks to Ginger and about her son Spencer, who was addicted and ended up in prison, and it's probably saved his life because he got him clean. A lot of addicts who end up in jails and prison, this is something that jails and prisons are not equipped to be addiction counselors, right? And yet they are forced to go clean because they don't have access to drugs. So in many cases, I think it has saved people's lives, but that's not what incarceration was meant to do. But they end up there because they steal. It ends up being a crime of theft to buy the drugs. And this is really... And
sometimes it's violent. I don't want to discount the seriousness of it.
Absolutely. And Beth Macy, who's a reporter with the Roanoke Times, wrote a wonderful book that is based entirely in Virginia, about Virginia, the genesis of the problem in the rural Southwest Virginia. But you know, we're starting to have a different conversation, mainly because this affects a lot of white people in our communities. When it was crack, when it was black people, it was crime. There was not rehabilitation or addiction or situational.
And people were judged as having low moral character. That's why they got addicted, instead of looking at it as a health problem.
So we've turned the corner on that, but I think race also plays a major role in the school to prison pipeline, and how different populations, you know, African Americans are overrepresented in Virginia's jails and prisons.
It's a fact.
So we need to own that problem, name that problem, and look at that as something that we have to solve. But the voters went to the poll in November 5th. They put new Commonwealth attorneys here in Northern Virginia, Alexandria, Loudoun County, Arlington, Prince William here in Fairfax. And they elected a Democratic majority in the House and Senate. It seems to me that there was a clear mandate from the public about criminal justice reform that means something.
No question about it. Criminal justice reform was on the ballot, and you now have a majority that's very interested, whereas before we would bring these bills, we couldn't even get a vetting for a lot of these bills. Now we're going to get a vetting. So solitary confinement now has a new life, a new opportunity to have a constructive conversation with the agencies affected, but with our delegates and our senators about the importance of it, and putting more resources, back to the Deeds Commission, more resources into the community for mental health, also for substance abuse as well. I think that's going to be on the governor's agenda. It's certainly on the Democrats' agenda as well. I think you're going to see a lot of changes, a lot of ways that we think differently about our entire criminal justice system.
And so you've got partners like the Virginia ACLU that is working very hard to compile the statistics and the data, because up until your bill that said you must collect and report the data, it was slim pickings in trying to even figure out who, what, when, where, and how.
Correct. And so now that we have some data, and we'll be looking, it'll be coming out, it looks like in October every year, a different report for the previous fiscal year. That's how it's set up. So we're hopeful that the data, and we hope that there's changes. There's going to be a bill submitted.
Not perfect.
Delegate hope it's submitted. That's going to put a severe limit on how long anyone can be in isolation. And there'll be some, reasons, exceptions to that. But on the whole, it'll be a very strong bill. And what's important about the bill, it also includes regional jails. not only the state system. So if this bill it progresses through the legislature, it'll have a tremendous effect throughout the state of Virginia as far as limiting. And it'll be similar. Recently, the state of New Jersey passed a epic-breaking bill about limiting solitary, and I think it'll be similar to that kind of bill as well.
And so, working with the Department of Corrections, how do you see that working? I mean, it's a big system. Let's face it. And they have their way of doing things, and and I know that Secretary Moran feels like they've made great strides.
Yeah, and they have.
And they have.
And they have. It should be recognized that they have, but they still have a little ways to go. And for those people that are in solitary for a long length of time, that we need to focus on trying to give them the tools that they need to be successful in the general prison population. And we can do it. Other states have done it, and I think we should. And there are exceptions, as I noted earlier, and we'll make sure that they're there. But we want to make sure that solitary is not used as a tool for retribution or anything like that. We want to make sure that it's used only when necessary, infrequently as possible, and not for any long periods of time.
Okay. And we want, as regard to your question, working with the department, we want to work with the department. Yeah. We don't see ourselves as adversaries necessarily to the department. We feel strongly that working in the prisons, correctional officers and other staff is a challenging and difficult job. We feel that too often the pay is too low. And should be higher. One of the reasons sometimes we don't get the best qualified staff is because the pay is so low. And for instance, we were told this summer that the ratio of mental health workers to incarcerated people is 1 to 250. So that alone, so, there's this. There needs to be some intensive work with people, hopefully not for a long period of time, but at least for a short period of time, and that kind of ratio is just is not acceptable. So we like to work with the department and support them to get the resources necessary so the ratio is much lower than 1 to 250, and more resources so that the correctional officers get better training. I mean, they do deal with difficult people and people who act out. There's no question about it, but too often, the instinct is to escalate with force the situation when there's incident instead of trying to de-escalate through proven methods. And so all that, it takes time, takes training, takes discipline to do that, and above all, it takes leadership. We think, but we would like to work with the department to see if we have a vision that this is where we want to go. And not just to punish the people and to beat them down, but to try to raise them up. I think that would be better for everyone, and it's something we could all support.
And we can be partners in all of this. I'm very fortunate to have Rabbi Feinberg and SALT, the big coalition of people, ACLU you mentioned, all at the table.
Also we should NAMI of Virginia,
we should
Cure
all be
Virginia,
all be at the table, be partners to solve this problem together. In previous years, you had appropriators, and in tight, lean budget years, which seems to be every single year, you look at this class of people and you think to yourself, we don't need to help them. There are other priorities that are more important than funding our prisons. And I think that needs to change, because we need to think of this as a community, as a continuum. These are people, these are human beings, and we need to treat people accordingly. And I think that with this line of thinking with Democrats and the governor, I believe that we will put more resources into our Department of Corrections and viewing the department as partners in doing this together.
And I think too that we need to get the public on our side, because everybody lives in a community where people are either going to engage with law enforcement, they're currently incarcerated, are going to come back to communities, and people want to feel like the people coming back not only do not threaten the safety of their community, but that they have the tools necessary to be successful contributing members of the community, right? And so unless someone's directly engaged with law enforcement, they're not thinking in terms of the fact that we've got people returning, and we were talking a little bit before the show about, how people are branded digitally now. It used to be, Jean Valjean stole a loaf of bread in Les Miserables, and he gets stamped as a criminal, and it follows him everywhere. But we have people who are getting felony charges over low-level drug possession who are getting out, and no matter where they go, they can't escape the fact that this shows up when they try to lease an apartment, apply for a job, apply for a loan.
So that's the other side of the problem.
Re-entry.
Is the barriers that we put up in front of people once they leave prison, and they are often incredibly high, those barriers, and difficult to overcome. So just to have a place to live, right? Often they're disqualified from having a place to live, often become homeless because of that. And then employment too is it's difficult.
Then it becomes a cycle.
Yeah.
So the people that were in and paid their debt get out and they never stop paying their debt.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And communities should care about this.
Well, you look at the appropriators, you could pay a little bit now or a lot later. And giving people the supports they need to be contributors to the community is the best way to go. It saves a lot of money down the road. So I do think makes good policy sense. The data shows that it does has a better return of investment.
We have to overcome the attitude of that the only way to deal with criminal activity is to punish people. Yes, punishment is part of the equation, but we have to. But what happens then once they are punished and put into prison? 95% will leave of people incarcerated will leave prison at some point, and it defies rationality to think that if you brutalize people and beat them down, that somehow that's going to make it better for them better for the community once they leave. And so we have to make the argument to the community that it's in their best interests to help people once they're in prison. That reentry starts once they enter those doors of prison and not when they leave prison.
Yeah.
Right? And so...
And the interesting thing is this is not a Democratic issue. This is not a Republican issue.
Right.
It's a bipartisan issue. And for different reasons, people come to this. But really, the old mentality of lock them up and throw away the key is very expensive. And what we put on mandatory minimums, or we have these labeling violent crimes, we keep people in prison longer. When the evidence tells us very clearly that locking them up, and if you release them, they're no more likely to reoffend than any other criminal. And so we're really costing our taxpayers a tremendous amount of money by this old way of thinking. And it's time that our code reflects those new realities.
Right.
I agree with both of you. And I want to explore more of this, especially let's talk about some of the things that might be on the table in the upcoming session that might address not only solitary confinement, but some of these larger issues that have needed addressing for a long time. Having safe communities is not mutually exclusive from serving the needs of people who are currently incarcerated. So please join us after the break.
Guess what? I have some news for you. There's free food right there, junk food. You see that truck? Oh, jeez. It's a 2 Michelin star chef. All for free, ladies and gentlemen. All for free.
Here we have a panzanella with summer vegetables and pesto. Enjoy. How we doing?
Fantastic.
So what do you got going on underneath that plate there?
This food is really about to be thrown away.
Yeah.
Is there something wrong with this food? Where did you get it from?
From farmers markets. They put aside the ugly vegetables and the ugly fruits.
Carrot top, soft avocados. It was all food that was going to be discarded.
Even the drink you had is made from like a little bruised peach. Did it taste a little bruised?
Great. It's good.
The average person throws away 24 pounds of food a month.
That's a lot.
Isn't that a lot? Go visit savethefood.com for more information. Thank you. Junk food time!
Give your town a reason to celebrate, because every Goodwill item you bring home brings job training and more to your community. Goodwill, bring good home.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're talking about solitary confinement, the use of solitary confinement, and why there's good reason to abolish the use of solitary confinement. Joining me in this last segment, Rabbi Charles Feinberg, who is the Executive Director of Interfaith Action for Human Rights, and Delegate Patrick Hope of House District 47. I want to talk a little bit about parole, because we abolished parole in Virginia, and I'm wondering to myself and out loud if this is something that we're going to re-examine now that there is a different makeup of the committees in the House, both chambers. Can you help to illuminate what might be on the table here?
Yeah, I think so, and I certainly want to wait for Governor Northam to speak on this, and I'm interested to hear what he thinks. In 2015, Governor McAuliffe put together a commission to study parole, and they made a series of different recommendations that have not been acted upon. And you can look at parole different ways. There's geriatric release, there's juvenile parole. There's a number of different things that we can do to reinstate parole very narrowly, or we can do it, just reinstate it so the parole board is looking at all these topics. And then we can engage in a study and things like that to make sure that we know exactly what we're getting ourselves into. But I think all that stuff is on the table. I think that you're going to see a robust agenda in doing that. And it does happen to come through the Militia, Police, and Public Safety Committee. I will introduce a bill to reinstate parole geriatric release for people that are elderly or physically disabled, that we want to release them, that they cause no threat to society. I'd like to see us do that. Juvenile parole, I believe that there is a bill that has been introduced. And so I'll be interested to see what the administration has in order to start moving in that direction.
So certainly one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons we have 2 million people behind bars in this country is because so many states, as well as the federal government, outlawed parole. So parole is one of the ways that kept the prison population down, that people could be released for good behavior much earlier than when their sentence was up. We also know that people from the age of 18 to 24, 25 are still developing intellectually and emotionally, as far as being able to have impulse control. And there's a clear relationship between the amount of crime in that age period, and then as people age out of that age period, they become more mature and more responsible and better disciplined as far as being able to take control of have some mastery of their feelings, so they don't act out as much. And so parole, I think it's one of the disasters in this country is that parole was, was banned in so many places without thinking through the consequences of that. And so you have that along with mandatory minimums. You have people in for a long time, and the 3 strikes you're out rule. People sometimes were convicted of 3 relatively trivial offenses, and then all of a sudden they're in for 25 years or 21 years. And so I support very much, and hope that the state of Virginia does look seriously about amending its parole rules now, the lack of parole.
Yeah, this is a tremendous opportunity to take a comprehensive look at criminal justice reform, and these are just a few elements to do that.
Yeah.
And like I said earlier, the earlier segment, we believe criminal justice reform was on the ballot, and we're committed to making some reforms in this session.
And I'm interested to know, if there's going to be money for data. And one of the things, to your point about who's being convicted of what kinds of felonies between the ages of 18 and 24, because we have basically ruined somebody's life. You talk about the digital imprint that follows them for the rest of their lives, and yet we have no idea at this juncture how many of the people going through the criminal justice system are in this category. This actually came up in a forum that I moderated with 2 Commonwealth attorneys candidates. And one believes in tracking data, and the other does not believe that that has anything to do with the role of Commonwealth attorney, these 2 candidates. But the fact of the matter is, it does matter.
Yeah, it does.
It does matter. And so Do you see fighting for, because everything comes down to money, and budgets are nothing more than priorities.
Yeah.
Appropriating money that says, before we can create good policy, first of all, we have to figure out what we are doing.
Yeah. I'm a data guy, and the person that you interviewed that doesn't like the data, doesn't think that that's their job, is really going to hate a bill that I'm going to bring, because it asks prosecutors to track the people that they are arresting, track their race, and track what their conviction was, so we can find out who we are charging and what types of sentences are they getting, and is it consistent across the board between people of color and otherwise. And I think that we'll be able to see county by county, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, to find out if there are any outliers in what's going on.
And practices. That's what data shows you.
And I tell
patterns and practices.
And I'm an attorney, and I know lawyers are overachievers. And when they see that data and they see that they're outliers, they'll want to take some corrective action.
Well, the pro-data candidate won, so you're good there.
Oh, good.
You've got an ally in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office.
Yeah.
But I do think this is important to look at, too, the people who fell in the gap when parole was abolished and juries did not understand that the sentencing recommendations that they made were even more punitive.
That's right.
Right? So, and I've seen some media stories recently about what is going to be done with these people languishing with these very punitive sentences for low-level crimes.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's the whole public policy of reinstating parole. And so we will take a hard look at that.
And so when you are looking at, what happens once you get what you're asking for? So it's like solitary confinement. So let's just dream a little bit. So they're going to dramatically reduce the situations under which it's used, and specifically the protocol, and everybody in every facility understands it's only used in this very restrictive sense. Once you get this, what is your next priority of asks for what you want to see happen?
Well, I think the kind of services that we think will make this practical. And so we need better services, better education. The whole issue of education in the prison system. This is both on the federal level as well as on the state level. So in the sometime during the 90s, I think it was in '94, part of the crime bill, they eliminated Pell Grants for anyone who was in prison. So this giving more educational opportunities so that people, when they leave prison, will have the education and the skills to reintegrate into the economy we have, which is, especially if they're a long time, it's like it's another universe now, right? As far as the work world goes. Yeah. Totally different. Right, so just think about it in those terms. You ask the person that's been in prison for 20 years, and they come out, and not only has the neighborhood changed, and where everything else that was familiar to them has changed, but just the whole how do you integrate into an economy that has changed so dramatically because of technology and other reasons. So,
and one of the things that I think we all take for granted is a government-issued ID. You can't do a whole lot with a government issue ID. We can get into the discussion about your right to vote and use of an ID to vote, but it's just going anywhere to get in.
How about your I-9? You apply for a job, and you have this set of documents, and one of them is a photo ID, like a driver's license, unless you have a passport. How many people getting out of prison have a passport?
Well, that's right. When you think about all the needs that you have in order to get an ID or a passport in the first place, you probably need some form of identification. Maybe it's your Social Security card, maybe it's your birth certificate, which if you're homeless at the time that you've been incarcerated, or you've been incarcerated for 10, 20 years, where are those documentations? So in working with SALT, we are going to put a bill in that would instruct the Department of Motor Vehicles to give the inmate, when they leave prison, some piece of paper, some record to show that was their place of residence and where they were.
It's a government-issued ID.
And they can take it to any DMV upon release and get a government-issued ID. And that will open up a whole world of whether it's employment opportunities or housing opportunities, those kinds of things that we all take for granted, that we carry and pull it out of our wallet whenever we need it. That will help that individual be successful. This is all about successful reentry. And we have to do this perfectly. And so when you transition from prison into the community, there has to be planning. You plan when you go on a trip You need to plan when you get released from jail. And we need to make sure all those pieces are in place to ensure that that individual has the best shot at success.
Yeah.
And the other one too, though, is TANF benefits.
Yeah.
And I know John Horsch, if he was sitting here with us, would say, "And what about TANF benefits?" There's so many benefits
But
that
now
are
they've been cut back by the feds, right?
But they're taken away from you if you're a felon.
That's right. No, that's right. And we need to reverse that. And I know John has been a staunch supporter of doing that. It's not that we don't have the funding. John was telling me that we have well over $100 million. We need to make sure that that money goes to the families. I mean, it's one thing that you want to penalize the individual who committed the crime, but the F in TANF stands for families. These have young children. They shouldn't be penalized. And so we want to make sure, again, giving them the best chance of success.
I mean, that's a whole nother issue is we've rightfully been, many people have been rightfully outraged by the separation of children from their parents at the border. But if you think about it, so we routinely do that when we imprison a parent and they separate the parent from their families. Recently we had a program and organization where we invited someone whose mother was incarcerated when she was 3 years old and was incarcerated for 18 years. And so she told about what her life was and how chaotic her life was, like, being shifted from one family to another, from one location to another during her upbringing, from the time she was 3 to the time she was 18. So we need to think about how to help families stay whole even when someone is behind bars.
And to reintegrate too. I know that Friends of Guest House in Alexandria has the largest reentry program for women in the Commonwealth of Virginia. That'd be 29 beds. That tells a story right there.
Yes.
But reunification is really the focus too. Families have to be put back together, and yet withholding TANF benefits, and there are hurdles that we are creating that make that very difficult for families to do. In just from a moral perspective, and let's just talk about the moral perspective of all of this too. We have criminalized poverty. A lot of people, there's racial injustice, no question, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but we also criminalize people for being poor. And I think one of the other things that came up in these Commonwealth attorneys races was cash bail. And the fact that poor people end up sitting in jail simply because they're poor. And what are we going to do about that? They lose their families, they lose their kids, they lose their jobs. Even if they ultimately end up being found innocent of the charges, their lives are ruined.
That's right. That's right.
So, I think as we go forward, and
bail reform is a big issue.
I think it is, and I think when we talk about criminal justice reform, there are so many moving parts to all of this, of which solitary confinement is, to me, attainable. And I don't think we'd be sitting here talking about it if we didn't believe that we can gain traction, that this is something we can say, okay, we can address, then we can do something with it.
Right.
But it is something that is part of a much broader look. The other thing is privatization of prisons. And that's another thing that came up during these races this year, is like, is our mass incarceration system feeding an economy where private businesses are making money off of our criminal justice system?
Yeah. No, and these are the biggest employers in some parts of our state. And clearly, and when you look at the prisons compared to the public versus private, the services are much worse in the private prisons, and so we need to take a hard look at what our population is that we have in private system prisons, and maybe outlaw the use of private prisons.
How many private prisons are there?
I don't think that there are many, but I do believe that there are some.
There are some.
Yeah.
Well, that's and legalization of marijuana, or at least the decriminalization of marijuana. Too many people, and the ACLU tracks this pretty carefully. I think there were convictions, 200 and some people were incarcerated, found guilty of these charges, whereas across the border in DC, it's legal.
Right.
And so, I hope that the Commonwealth of Virginia, by sending people to the legislature who represent what they feel are their values, that we will start to see some movement on this.
You will.
But appropriations is something else entirely. I like to give little mini civics lessons in these shows, and that is you can't just have everything you want because there's a price tag.
Yeah.
So it might get out of committee and then it goes to appropriations, and then we have to decide in a balanced budget state who gets some and who doesn't.
Yeah. Well, you
Well,
try to
that's-
put in bills that don't cost money. That's always been my theory, and try to avoid the Appropriations Committee whenever possible. I do look at things like solitary confinement, other issues that we've talked about here. I do believe will actually save money, and we're lower cost. And I think you start closing certain wings of prisons, even closing prisons. You reinstate parole and doing something about mandatory minimums. You're not warehousing people anymore. You might be in a place where you can close prisons. That saves a tremendous amount of money. And that's why I said earlier that this is a bipartisan issue. Republicans and Democrats in other states have supported the things that we're talking about here. And some Republicans, conservatives, come to this topic because it saves money. And I think that we can do a lot of great things with the resources that we have.
We should not ignore the political dimension, which you mentioned, which you alluded to when you said that these prisons are in communities that have very little other sources of employment.
Yeah.
True, but you take a
and so
corrections
that's-
officer, you make them a parole officer, right? Like there are ways to say, we'll take them out of the prison, and now you can be a
Yeah.
parole officer and help with supervised oversight when they're back in
Yeah.
the community.
Easier said than done, I
know.
think.
It's wishful thinking,
In any case,
probably.
they're built-in special interests now, and it was designed for that, I think, right, in that way. So, so it's another level of complexity to the whole issue as well.
Well, to your point, this is the most progressive legislature that we have had ever in 400 years. Even when Democrats controlled the legislature back in 1993, I think, it was a more conservative Democratic Party. There were a lot of Dixiecrats still. And this is a whole new era. And I think the people have sent a clear message in the voter turnout, which is the highest I think it's ever been for an off-year election. Right. People took an interest in everything from the school board to the sheriff to the Commonwealth's attorney, and they sent a clear message that says that we want to do better.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I think voters should hold us accountable. The people that are watching this program, they need to always write their senators and their delegates to tell them how they feel. But we do take it very seriously. We have an opportunity to perform, and we're committed to do that, and criminal justice is one of the highest priorities for us.
I want to thank you both for being here. I want to remind people that the legislative session starts January 8th. It runs through March 7th. The doors to the legislature are open from Monday through Friday. People should go to the website for SALT. They should go to the Virginia ACLU. They should go to IAHR
website,
and find out when you're going to be there. They should pay attention to committee hearings. To Delegate Hope's point, an email makes a difference, a phone call makes a difference. Showing up, you are telling your legislator what matters to you. And as a constituent, that is your currency, is the fact that you are holding your elected official accountable. So I would encourage everyone to engage this legislative
And your
session.
constitutional right to redress your government.
That's right. Thank you so much for joining us on Inside Scoop.